So it's a pleasure this afternoon for me to introduce and welcome Professor Roger Trigg. Roger is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Warwick, a Senior Research Fellow at the Ian Ramsay Centre in Oxford. He's written a number of books, one of which I will just give a quick plug through this afternoon, which I think will form part of the basis of his talk. Does Science Undermine Faith? It's only just over 50 pages long, very readable, and I'll spare Roger's blushes in recommending it for you. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Roger and ask him to give his presentation to us. Over to you, Roger.
Well, good afternoon, or morning, or evening, or wherever you are. It's so good to be able to speak to people across the world. Now, the subject that I've been set is how do we know what we know in science and religion? And I think one of the problems nowadays is that most people, many people, certainly many young people, would say, well, science tells us what we know, but why should religion? Religion doesn't tell us about anything. Religion isn't about reality at all. In fact, many people would say religion is a matter of faith, and they would use the faith in a slightly pejorative way. It's something subjective. It's something that, in fact, I am responsible for myself, but it needn't concern anybody else. And so faith is something that can't be reasoned about, rationally justified. And a corollary of that, and it's a very big result, is that actually faith is not something you ought to talk about in the public square. All right, people can go to church, synagogue, or mosque and do what they want there, but they shouldn't bring it out in public, because it doesn't deal with the facts. And so many people would say, well, faith is one thing, but the facts are the other. And how do we know the facts? Science tells us. What science can't tell us isn't factual. And sometimes almost it actually takes the form of placards in that science is about reality, science is real, as if everything else are alternative facts or fiction. Now, why we got to this stage? Why is there such a touching faith in science? The speaker this morning mentioned scientism, which is really the belief that science tells everything. Science explains everything. Science is the last word on what is real. Now, I think that we do live in one world, one reality. It's the same reality wherever you are in the world, and science confronts that same reality. But I don't think science exhausts the nature of that reality. I would maintain that religion is also concerned with that reality. Indeed, and this is perhaps jumping ahead of myself for a moment, I think we only talk about one reality because actually of the legacy of a belief in the one God who created the one reality. How can we be so sure that there is just one reality that functions in one way everywhere? Not just in Beijing and London, not just in Washington, D.C. and Moscow, but we actually think that scientists on Earth can tell us what the other side of the universe is like, even though it's in principle impossible for us ever to observe it or get there. Indeed, some scientists want to talk about there being many universes. Well, whether there are or not, and that's another issue. Certainly, they're talking about reality beyond what any of us can imagine or reach. It is by any definition a transcendent reality. So even science talks about a reality that sometimes is beyond what we can get hold of. Now, this isn't where a lot of the modern views of science started. I was taught in Oxford more years ago now than I care to admit by Professor A.J. Ayer, who was a logical positivist. He had been to meetings of the Vienna Circle, which were mentioned briefly this morning by the speaker. And the Vienna Circle believed that in what they termed the scientific world conception, what science couldn't tell you wasn't real. Science is the arbiter of truth. Now, there was a problem about that, because when you talk about science, what do you mean? I mean, the original word science, of course, comes from the Latin scientia, which means knowledge. But do we mean actual knowledge, what people have now in science? Do we mean possible knowledge, or the knowledge one day people might have, or even one day in principle they could have? Are we talking about actual knowledge here and now, or where science one day might get? This actually did worry people in the Vienna Circle who were meeting in Vienna. Incidentally, they were very influential and then scattered because of the Second World War, and that's why their views were spread in both in America in particular and in the United Kingdom. But with their verification principle, the idea that nothing in fact was meaningful unless you knew how it could be verified, they were rather placing a premium on present day knowledge. Now, at the time, this dates me, people hadn't seen the other side of the moon. They were about to go around the moon, but they hadn't actually seen it. Now, for verificationists, they would say, well, we haven't actually verified what the other side of the moon looks like. The satellites haven't gone around there. Is there such a thing even? In fact, you could get worried about that. Shows what a curious view it is. In fact, what it's doing is reducing what is real to how humans happen to be able to find it out. It makes reality, to use a posh word, anthropocentric. It's just relating it to us. And that means that what's real is determined by our own human limitations. Where we are, who we are, what we can find out, what our technological progress allows us to find out. Well, needless to say, the Vienna Circle's views were regarded in the end, I think, as not satisfactory even for physics. As I mentioned, physics has gone on way beyond talking about what is just within the reach of present day physicists. Incidentally, it was one day when I was visiting Vienna, I was going up the steps of the university, and I was shown one step where a leading member of the Vienna Circle, Schlick, had actually been assassinated by a graduate student. I must say it gave me pause for thought, because I hadn't realized philosophy could be quite that dangerous. But still, before the war, they were influential. And then, as I said, their influence spread. And their influence, which you can see even in the works of people like Richard Dawkins, who was influenced by them, that their influence is very much that science tells us what's true, religion is meaningless. You can't even formulate proper propositions. And this does apply nowadays very much. Science works, we're told, which is an answer supposedly to the question, why trust science? Which is a real question. Because if science is so ready to tell us what's true, how can we be sure it's telling us the truth? And you need to be able to stand out science to say that, outside it. And yet, scientists want to say, in fact, that no, in fact, science is its own arbiter. And some scientists would even belittle philosophy and say, no, it's science that sets the standard for knowledge. Science works. Well, is that an answer? Some people say every time you step on an aeroplane, if you can, that you're really proving that you believe science works. You trust the technology. But why do we trust the technology? How are we sure about science? Is it all an illusion? I think that the development of the present pandemic has given some people pause for thought. In the United Kingdom, particularly, the government was initially, at any rate, and still is, very inclined to follow what they termed the science. What is the science? They wanted science-led, evidence-led policy. And I mean, it sounds very good. If you look at what scientists say the virus is behaving like, and how they predict it will behave, and you act accordingly. The only problem with that, which I recognized last March, was that there is no such thing as the science. What is the science? It's scientists, many of whom disagree. There are different branches of science with different emphases, coming at the subject in different ways. And above all, you had a new virus that was behaving in different they couldn't predict how the virus would behave because, well, perhaps they assumed at the beginning, perhaps it was a bit like flu, but it wasn't. So they couldn't predict anything there. All they could do was make informed guesses. Well, that's not giving us knowledge. That's not basing even policy on anything very firm. And the reason is that science is up against a reality that's independent of science. And the scientists are limited by their own limitations, their own experience, their own technology, etc. And although science would hope to gain more experience of the virus and treat it better, it doesn't follow that science knows all about it straight away, or that it ever perhaps will fully be able to understand everything. Science is perhaps a very rational way of proceeding in trying to deal with the real world, but it is by no means infallible. Indeed, the whole point about science is that it is fallible. Science is provisional and tentative. Scientists have to be prepared to revise their theories. They have to be prepared to test them, to compare them with other theories. And I'm afraid that unanimity among scientists is no guarantee of truth. Scientists can very often, in fact, all agree and later find that they've been very wrong. And another thing this pandemic has shown is that really, although science seems to be able sometimes to manage the visible world, faced with new situations, it has its limitations. It can't. It can't control new situations. So science gives an illusion of mastery over the physical world, but science, as I've said, is produced by scientists who are finite. Well, how can we even be sure that scientists have got a grasp on anything approaching the real world? How can we understand that a scientific theory is more than the reflection of the dreams and wishes of scientists? Indeed, some cynics have sometimes thought that. And if you look back more than 100 years in science, most of what was said then in physics, say, was inadequate. Perhaps most of what scientists are saying now in 100 years' time will be rejected. Does that mean there's no truth to be found out? We've got to, in fact, keep a grasp on truth, on the idea of a reality to be discovered. And in a way, that suggests that science itself needs to be underpinned by something. How can we be sure that the world is regular, that we can trust from our experience in one situation that it will be much the same in another? How can we be sure that what's true here will be true there, that what's true in Beijing is true here, as far as, say, the behavior of the virus is concerned, most likely to be true? Nevertheless, science has tended to build itself up, as I've said, in the influence of the Vienna Circle and later, with a doctrine really that's called naturalism, that says that what science says in dealing with the natural world defines the world. There is no room for the supernatural. So human reason is defined in terms of scientific method. But again, why trust science? There are more efficient ways of killing people because of science. Technology can help us to do much more than we used to. Perhaps even the future of our planet is in danger if one believes a lot of what's said about global warming. There seems to be good reason to do so. A lot of people even give up on science and think that actually it's not doing us any good. This goes against what some people say. Steven Pinker, some of you may have read his book on Enlightenment, Enlightenment Now, the case for reason, science, humanism, and progress. And in that book, he says that science, and it's a very Enlightenment view coming from the 18th century really, that science is the vehicle of human reason, and that will make things better and better. Things will become everything we want them to be gradually. He produces lots of statistics to show that in fact the world is getting better. But I find that as much of an act of faith as any faith in God, because when I look at the world, I'm not sure that things are getting better. You can blank out a lot of the history of the 20th century with its dictatorships and mass murder. And even now, looking at the state of the world, we can hardly think things are going forward very rapidly. So a belief that they are, a belief in progress, is a touching faith that things will be better. In fact, as many people are pointing out, that very faith in progress is a kind of hangover from belief in a divine providence, that things are getting better or things are in the hand of God. Without that, there's very little reason to believe it, really. And yet, this whole colonization of facts and reality by science is widespread. One book, very obviously called Faith versus Fact, makes really the argument of the book very clear. It says that naturalism is now taken for granted as the guiding principle for science. And part of the problem there is what's counted as naturalism. Because if it suggests, as I think the author was rather tending to suggest, that it cuts out any possibility of access to another reality, a supernatural reality, a transcendent reality, that's going way beyond what he is warranted to say by the methods of science. And I just would like to make a distinction between methodological naturalism. In other words, science is always going to be looking for explanations within its reach. It's no good looking out and saying, well, the fairies did that at the bottom of the garden. That's not a scientific explanation. That's not going to be something a scientist will accept. But that just means that science has blinkers on. It's looking for particular kinds of explanation, a very fruitful way of progressing. But it doesn't mean it's the only possible form of explanation, and that science deals with the whole of reality. There is as well a metaphysical naturalism that says, oh, there is no God, nothing supernatural. And that's a philosophical argument beyond science. And the very fact it exists shows that you've got to get out of science to talk about it. So science itself is not its own arbiter there. But if we look at the relationship of religion and and science sometimes seeming too cocksure about its abilities, so I don't want to say you shouldn't trust science, but science is not the only arbiter of reality. It's not an infallible guide to reality. But if you look at, say, the comparison between science and philosophy, or even science and religion, one thing scientists like to say, and I remember what scientist once said to me about philosophy, this was, oh, well, he said, in science, we don't have French science or Anglo-American science. You have French philosophy and Anglo-American philosophy, but if we only have science, we're looking at what's true. Well, the thought behind that is, of course, there are settled procedures in science which get unanimity in science across the world. And that is indeed the aim, although it's not always the reality. I mean, you get plenty of disagreement among scientists. I saw one quote from one cosmologist who said if you get 10 cosmologists in the room, they're all going to be absolutely certain and all different from each other. So you'll find that certainty itself is no guarantee of truth. Even great knowledge in science is no guarantee, because we're always stretching to something that's beyond our reach, particularly at the frontiers of knowledge. So, although, and this is a point that people want to make very much, religious diversity is a problem for religion and for our pursuit of truth, because religious people disagree with each other. Muslims deny the divinity of Christ, for instance. Buddhists do not think of a creator God in the same way as Christians. So you could go on. And it's easy for people to say, well, it's all rubbish, and that's the argument of Richard Dawkins. Which God should you believe in? Well, none of them, says sneeringly. But that assumes there is a unanimity of science, which again is set against religion. But once you're stretching out beyond what we really know, it's clear that what we're up against is human limitation, human finitude, that we don't actually able to understand everything. When science reaches itself, beyond itself, as in cosmology, there are many theories, but no universal agreement. And the point is that although some scientists will say, but we know in principle how to resolve the issue, actually we're getting to some areas in cosmology, for instance, where it's difficult to know how you would. I don't know how, from a scientific point of view, you could ever settle the answer. There are many universes all out of touch with each other. An infinite number of universes says something. Well, maybe mathematical calculations which would suggest that, but I don't know how you'd ever check it and how you would ever prove it. Modern science, you see, has developed in such a way that it isn't a deduction, as the Vienna Circle saw, from empirical data. It isn't a deduction from what we experience. We have to have theories that go beyond that. And very often, quite far beyond, you can get the same data and have different theories from it. I remember the American philosopher Quine saying that if you were standing on the banks of, say, Loch Ness and saw a sinewy monster going along, or at least 3 sinewy shapes, if you just caught a glimpse of it, there would still be an issue, and this is his argument for the underdetermination theory by data. There would still be a point that you couldn't know if it was 3 different animals jumping in unison or one sinewy monster. And perhaps it wouldn't be possible to get further observations, so you'd never be able to settle that. Once, though, we go into the realm of theory, we have to then begin to use our rational judgment. And the alleged consensus obtainable in science, but allegedly not in religion, is itself no guarantee of truth. Unfortunately, the world has been full of people, scientists, who've been certain and completely wrong. Now, one answer to this is the actual one of nihilism, that, well, nothing in fact is possible. Nowadays, we find that more people than we think are espousing that view. Nietzsche wanted to say, in fact, that the basic longing for certainty that present discharges itself, for instance, he says, in scientific positive fashion amongst large numbers of people. They want something stable, he says. And he thinks this is a sign of an instinct of weakness. A spirit should bear farewell to every belief, to every wish for certainty. Such a spirit would be the free spirit par excellence. Now, of course, notoriously, Nietzsche was against God. He thought, and he advocated what he called the death of God, that there was no God, no metaphysics, no grounding for it. But he took that line very seriously. There's no grounding for knowledge, no reality. Everything's interpretation. Everything's a matter of will. Everything, then, is a matter of power, because that's all we're left with, is the will to power. And I'm afraid, just as an aside, I think sometimes looking at the world nowadays, there are too many people who are unwilling to use reason, whether of a scientific or further kind, and just indulge in power, and just think that the largest voices are the ones that should be heard. Now, on that, I would back the Enlightenment view of reason, but I think the Enlightenment view of reason was itself grounded in a view of God. Unfortunately, the Enlightenment came after centuries of Christian influence, and they wanted to keep a lot of Christian influence without the Christianity. So they wanted to believe in progress without providence, truth without God, morality without a grounding for morality, and so on. They want everything to be the same while they've changed everything. This comes out particularly in the notion of what it is to be human. or what are human rights? How can we believe in that unless we believe that, in fact, there is such a thing as being human? What is that? Well, the traditional view was that we're all made in the image of God. Even the French slogan at the time of the French Revolution, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, were all words that came from a Christian theological context. Liberty, because God gave us freedom. Equality, we're all equal in the sight of God. And fraternity, brotherhood, a fashion word now, but nevertheless the suggestion was there, well, you could only be brothers or sisters, children, if you're children of the same father. Well, that again points to a divine origin. And I think the question nowadays that faces us, and even faces science too, and faces any notion of reason, is whether Nietzsche may not have been right, that if you demolish the theological foundation for science, for religion, for anything, what have you got left? Our beliefs in the importance of these things, but how substantial are they? How can we teach those beliefs? Why are those things important? Why is humanity important? Because we think so. Why do we think so? Well, that's what we think. Is that good enough? There are plenty of people who don't think it is important. Plenty of people who it's just a Western construction, Western imperialism work. And so there is a very, very difficult question. So I think we all ought to think that reason itself, beyond science and in science, itself needs a foundation. Science itself cannot float free. If we look back at the history of science, of course, modern science, which I suppose developed really in the 17th century, was very much the product of people who believed in the creator God. However you account for the notion of laws, obviously the idea of laws depended on a lawmaker. The idea of regularity in the universe depended on the assumption that God had made the universe in a particular way, that he made it to be regular. And in addition, he made human beings in his image so that they themselves could rationally discover the inherent rationality of the world. At the beginning of St. John's Gospel, when we have the famous passage in the beginning was the traditional translation is word. The Greek word was logos, a word of very resonant philosophical implications to Greek philosophy. It meant the rational underpinning of everything, the reason present in everything. Now speech is reason, which comes out in communication. But it isn't just speech. Logos is the reason, the rationale. I mean, you can understand part of the weight of that word because, of course, we get the English word logic from it. But underneath everything, there is a rationale to be discovered, a regularity, an order in the world. And we humans, it said, are attuned in such a way that our reason can actually gain hold of it. Now, that means that science itself, if you will face the question, why trust science? Why should we bother about science at all? Because, as I said, it has ambiguous consequences sometimes, and it isn't necessarily infallible. Why should we trust it? Because we've been given a reason that can get to grips with the world, and the world is such that it can be understood. It is one world created by the one God. Now, how does this affect religion? How do we have knowledge in religion? Now, if what I've been saying about the idea of reality is concerned, that it's independent of our knowledge, that ontology is different from epistemology, then what there is and how we know it are always going to be different. There's going to be a gap. And science, with its instruments, its technology, based in the end on human perception and human experience, but that enables us to get to grips on the reality around us, sometimes not altogether successfully. But there is a reality there. We bump against it, sometimes literally. Now, what about religion? What is the reality we're dealing with there? By definition, it's transcendent, really almost beyond our reach. And that means that although we have been given through our senses access to the reality around us, and some assurance that the way we reason about it can be justified, because the world is such that it can be understood. How do we know anything about a world beyond this one? And the traditional answer, of course, is by different forms of revelation. Indeed, if we really believe there is a God, and rather than a faith, which I started off with as just a subjective, nice feeling that some people have and some people don't, but if it's actually faith in something, faith in a reality, if we actually believe that there is a reality to be approached, a reality to be discovered, we might also think that the reality might come halfway to meet us. If you believe in a God, a personal God, why doesn't he make it easier for us to believe in him? Well, perhaps he does to some extent. And there are two forms of revelation which I can just mention very quickly. And that one is, of course, particular special revelation through prophets, through Christ, through the Bible, and different things like that. But there's also a general revelation. And I think the general revelation is partly our endowment with reason, which enables us to go some way to understand the world around us. There's a lovely saying, a motto of a group of thinkers in Cambridge in the 17th century: reason is the candle of the Lord, reason is rooted in God. Now, the Enlightenment wanted to indulge in reason without God. Reaction to the Enlightenment, Nietzsche and people after, postmodernists, more or less said, well, that shows that reason is just a product of a particular place and time. It's not really reliable. But there is a general revelation as well, not just our reason, but I've, over the years, was helping to direct an interdisciplinary research project in Oxford on the cognitive science of religion. I haven't got time to say very much about this, but just draw your attention to the fact that it's saying that religion is natural in human beings. This is a scientific project. Interestingly enough, it's done research in China as well, and shows even the reaction of people in a non-monotheistic culture is very similar. They see purpose in things. They tend to see the mind as a part of the body. They tend to see divine agency sometimes in things, and so I could go on. There is a natural tendency to think in a particular way that leads to religion. Now, this isn't absolute revelation. They're not suddenly told inwardly through evolution that Christ is the Son of God. But there is what I might term a God-shaped hole in their understanding. There is a readiness to understand, and you find this in Douglas of Child Gilman as well, a readiness to understand that there could be a God who knows everything, who could, in fact, be able to approach us. So I don't think that modern research shows that we are the philosopher's blank slate, the white sheet on which nothing is written until experience comes. We're born with certain tendencies, and one of those tendencies is a tendency to see things in a religious way. Incidentally, even someone like Richard Dawkins would accept that, because he would just say, well, it's infantile, you've got to grow out of it. And that was the theme of his latest book. That it's something that, in fact, we shouldn't take seriously. But we do, as children, we do very often across the world take it seriously. And that's why religion can't be discounted. In some ways, religion is more natural in human beings than science. It's easier to accept religious explanations sometimes than scientific ones, which is perhaps one reason why stories of neo-Darwinism are much harder to accept than fixed ideas of God as creator. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be accepted, but what I'm saying is that that our intuitive reactions tend to one way rather than another. Perhaps God has planted a seed in us that we look towards God. So we're not just blank sheets of paper. We're not just slates on which nothing is written. We already have certain tendencies, although I believe very strongly we have freedom and we have the rationality that goes with freedom to enable us to make up our own mind about these things. And that's a very precious thing in science. Science without freedom is impossible. And it's a precious thing in religion as well. But without a belief in God as the source of truth, reason becomes unsupported, and I think we do collapse into Nietzsche's nihilism. That, in fact, it's not science that's the alternative to religion. It's the idea that, well, nothing matters. It's just what we decide arbitrarily, and that really means, as Plato began his Republic, asking perhaps what is justice, might is the interest, the right is the interest of the stronger. It becomes down to just the war of everyone against everyone. There is no reason, no truth. We just fight each other. Well, I think that's not just a dismal prospect. I think it's impossible to live like that. And I always thought it wasn't a coincidence that Nietzsche went mad and died in the 19th century asylum. I don't think that you can actually take his beliefs and live a coherent life. But a belief in God itself, I do believe, can give us an assurance that knowledge is possible, both about God and his will, and about the world in which we're placed, with a rationality that can, both in science and elsewhere, at least partially. Now we see through looking glass dimly, but then face to face. Our knowledge now is partial. So both science and religion depend on capabilities which theists believe, at any rate, were given by God. So I would say, so far as science driving that religion, it needs theistic belief. Well, thank you very much. I'll be very glad to know what questions you have to answer, or to have to ask about that. So I look forward to hearing you. Thank you.
Roger, thank you very much for that talk. It's that's set our minds thinking, and there's a few questions coming in. Can I remind people, you can either submit a question via the chat line, the chat box on the YouTube, or the Q&A link on the Zoom, which, depending on what device you're looking on, is probably on the bottom, across the bottom of your screen somewhere. And I will then filter those questions and pass them on to Professor Trigg. There's a few that have come in already. Please carry on sending them in. One says, Roger, can I put to you that some people would say, well, it's a natural tendency to think in a religious way and to see divine agency in all sorts of things. Is that a cognitive bias from seeking agency in everything and just looking for, if like, a reason when maybe there isn't one?
Yes, well, I think that's true. We have a cognitive bias, and we see, I mean, there is a cognitive bias to seeing purpose in the world. And actually, there are interesting experiments with even sophisticated scientists when they have to answer very quick questions. And you can find there that they quickly slip from a strictly scientific view of causation to one of purpose sometimes. That you can easily start talking in terms of the reason why things happen in a purposive way. And certainly when you look at child development, children certainly think in that way. I mean, there was a survey that showed that when little children are asked, why are rocks pointed? Now, of course, they're not going to come up with erosion or anything like that, but they'll come up with issues about purpose, and it's perhaps personal agency. They'll say, it's so that birds can't sit on them. Now, I think there is that bias, and I think it happens to all of us when something terrible happens, particularly to oneself. One thinks, why did that happen? Why did it happen to me? And that's a very natural reaction. I It's not necessarily rational, but it is natural. That's what we tend. That's the first thing that comes into mind sometimes.
Thank you. It is a provocative question. I think you said words to the effect of, without a belief in God, we collapse into nihilism. Words to that effect. Is that the only outcome that we see? Because that probably we don't see that in most of the people that we meet. They may be neither theists nor nihilists. Is that because they're living in denial?
Well, I think that was part of the point of what I wanted to raise. That I think the tendency, indeed even since the Enlightenment, is to click away the foundations for a lot of our beliefs and so go on believing. In other words, you believe in progress, but you don't believe in a God in charge of things. You believe in the importance of human beings, but you don't believe in any reason why they are important. And you believe in morality, but you don't think there's any foundation for it. And so you can go on. You believe in the regularity of the universe, but why is it regular? Well, it is just. It just is. And then you get down to brute facts. And I think we're coming up against, particularly nowadays in philosophy with postmodernism and subsequent views, questions about how sustainable some of these views are. And that's what worries me. I mean, people have been very comfortable in the past, particularly in science, of going on believing in science without its theological foundation. But what is its philosophical foundation? I mean, the answer for some people is to say, well, let's do away with philosophy. But that doesn't, or just make it true by definition. I mean, one of the things with the verification principle of the logical positivists, which was that everything is in fact true only if you know how to verify it. And the immediate comeback is, well, how do you verify that principle? And that's a common objection. And I remember years ago asking A.J. Ayer, who's a patron saint of this country, well, what his answer to that was. And he said, oh, it's an axiom. Now, I think you can have different axioms and different starting points, and that didn't seem to me to be a really very satisfying answer. And I think that a lot of people are quite right. They want to go on believing in these things, but they're struggling to say why.
Thank you. Maybe I can follow that up with you talk about verification and how things are validated. Do scientific theories need to be validated by evidence in order to be true? If not, how else do we know truth? Is it possible to have a scientific theory without evidence?
A scientific theory could be true without us having evidence, but we wouldn't know it was true. I mean, our knowledge is obviously related to what kind of evidence we can get hold of. So a rational theory does depend on justification and evidence. But sometimes, of course, theories rather outstrip that. And sometimes they hope that the evidence will be forthcoming in the future as technology develops. Sometimes, if it isn't forthcoming, I do think there are dangers that science can itself begin to take off into philosophy or metaphysics, which isn't a bad thing, but they should know what they're doing.
Thank you. Thank you. You drew a useful analogy during your talk about the present COVID crisis and the way in which science is being used in that, and in some ways showing that science at least says that we have something to go on, even though we may not be certain. It's not just a matter of guesswork, but there's some objective judgment that goes into that, even though it's not certainty. Do you want to elaborate a little bit upon that, about generally views of science rather than just that specific one, about how provisional science might be?
Yes, I think there's a tightrope here, because you don't. I certainly don't want to stop trusting science, because science is the best way we have of systematizing our rational investigation of the world around us. But I think we must always realize it is provisional, it is tentative, it's open to questioning, it's open to questioning by other scientists and to subsequent knowledge. And sometimes I think people assume that, well, to put it bluntly, many white coats know. And that doesn't actually follow. I mean, I think that you mentioned the current crisis. I felt that people were too trusting of what scientists were saying at the beginning. And even now, I mean, scientists are saying much more explicitly now, well, we didn't know. It was an unknown virus. And yet they were a bit reluctant to say that. If they'd said, well, we just don't know, I mean, we haven't got the information, I think perhaps governments might have thought, well, we've got to be very careful here, we've got to make our own judgments here. But following the science just shoves off the responsibility, but it shoves the responsibility onto people who really can't take it because they haven't got the knowledge, they can't have the knowledge at that point. And I think there is this idea that science explains everything. And we've got to say, well, what science? Present-day science, these scientists? And once you start questioning it, you see how provisional it all is.
Thank you. Here's a question that maybe turns things up the other way. Timothy Radcliffe, I'm told, characterized scientific method as systematic doubt. I think a lot of scientists would say that things are provisional, but the question is, should we apply the same to our faith? Yes,
and of course, doubt is part of faith in a way. I mean, it's absolute certainty. In one way, it's laudable. I've tended to make a distinction between the beliefs on which our faith are founded and the commitments we give. We can have an absolute commitment. We can be willing to bet our life on something. And at the same time, realize that what we're betting our life on is something we don't fully know. We can't know. I mean, we don't know the nature of God because he is above anything we can understand. And we can feel we have good reason from revelation and so on. But in the end, I think humility in our ability to know is part of the whole process of faith. And there is, I mean, doubt is not necessarily a sign of faith. I mean, there are people who would say, well, if you're at all doubtful, that shows you're not committed. You've got to be certain. And that's why some people attack religion and say, well, it's just an irrational fanaticism. And I think that that's very dangerous. I think it is actually dangerous for any religious person to refuse to look at arguments against it. Faith is thinking you will always find a good argument because if you believe it's true, then it is true. I mean, if you're right. But nevertheless, shutting your mind to things doesn't help. I remember coming across a woman once who said, no, she wasn't going to go in the Natural History Museum. She didn't want to see all the evidence about Darwinism. It might shake her faith. You see there's something very, very shaky and not right about it. So no matter how firm your faith, you've got to face up to possibilities. I mean, after all, as I mentioned earlier, with St. Paul saying, now we see through a glass darkly and face to face in the resurrection. I mean, that suggests that we don't have full knowledge and we can't have full knowledge. And when we don't have full knowledge, I mean, the Greek word there that he uses is it's an enigma, which is quite a strong word to talk about the basis of our faith.
Thank you. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the criteria, though, for religious knowledge. For scientific knowledge, we can do experiments to test things. We can show whether a theory is crazy or possible, or maybe, as far as we can tell, true. But with religious knowledge, how do we tell right ones from wrong ones?
Yes, and of course this is important because there are all kinds of alternative revelations, and it's easy for people to say, well, there are lots of different revelations, how do you know any of them? They're all false. And one has to use one's reason here. I think if you believe reason is the canon of thought, you shouldn't be afraid to use it. But reason obviously can't just sit in judgment on everything, because what is beyond our reason sometimes, God, can't just be ruled out. I mean, that's the trouble with scientism. That's really saying what human reason is capable of is all that there is. Well, I don't hold with that. I mean, one traditional formula, which is quite a deep formula, I think, is that you need not just reason, you need to respect Christian tradition, and you need to respect Christian scripture. That's in the best Christianity. So reason, tradition, scripture, and they all have to advance together. I mean, if your reason goes against the other two, well, that's an issue, and if tradition goes against reason, but they shouldn't be. One shouldn't be prior to the other, and that's a tricky way of dealing with it. And I remember, I know in some circles they would add it as well with religious experience as well. So there are things that go in tandem. I'm not suggesting there are easy answers to this, but reason should neither be discounted nor the limits of our reason dictate what there is.
Thank you. So some would, rightly say that science is obviously practiced by scientists and religion is practiced by religious people and talked about by theologians, but all of those are people. How do we see past the human frailty within that, in both in the science and the religious sphere?
Yes. Well, I think it's very important to see. I mean, that's one of the things I said, that the limitations on science is in time and space, apart from just their human ability. Because, of course, science itself can get corrupted by all kinds of external influences, need for political recognition, or just fiddling your results to make sure you get another grant. I mean, all kinds of things going on in science sometimes, which shouldn't go on. I mean, scientists would say that's not science, but human frailty means they do. Same in religion. There's all kinds of human frailty working, because this is what people traditionally call sin. Now, I don't think sin is so far-reaching that we can't realise what's true, but we should realise that sometimes what we want to be true is not necessarily a good guide, and that ties up with it as well. So this is a kind of tricky area we are human, and we have to know our own shortcomings. And I suppose that's what confessing sin is all about.
Thank you. You very helpfully talked about reason needing a foundation and seeing some of that foundation in God. One question that turns that round the other way is, does God need a foundation in the same way that reason needs a foundation?
Well, I suppose the answer to that is God is the foundation. And that's a little bit reminiscent of Bertrand Russell's old chestnut about, well, God created the world, who created God? And it's inviting us to an infinite regress. Now, of course, the problem is you've got to stop somewhere, and this is why some people would say, let's stop with the world and not God. But God is the ultimate. So if you go to God, you don't go on any further. God is the ultimate foundation. Now, some people would say, well, there is no ultimate. But then I think that what you take as ultimate in this world begins to kind of splinter into pieces as well. And so you can't live in one world with regularity and predictability and say there is no God. That's what
Thank you. Excuse me one moment while I scroll through and see what other questions we've got. There have been quite a few coming in, and I've taken them in a random order. So apologies if I've skipped past that. Some that are quite important. You challenged, if you like, a multiverse theory as being something that's outside of science. What would happen if such a theory had observable consequences? Could they be tested or could they not?
I don't see how they can by definition, because it depends how you define a multiverse. But if you say that the multiverse consists of even an infinite number, but a vast number of billions perhaps of alternative universes with different physical laws, all of them out of contact with each other, by definition, we don't know what we're talking about. I mean, science can't touch that. I mean, it's what we're saying is we're talking about universes beyond the reach of science, so we want science to tell us about it. Well, that doesn't make any sense. What is at issue is why people want to talk about it in the first place. I mean, it's very metaphysical. Of course, very often, I mean, the crude answer is that they're trying to give an answer to the anthropic principle, which says there is a design from the start. And why are we in this universe? Why is this universe ordered as it is? Some people would say, well, there's a purpose of design. Other people would say, no, it's all chance, and it's all chance because we're one of an infinite number of universes. So that's just in a sense refusal to answer the question why. But whether there could be a scientific answer, I mean, you could imagine certain what entities the universe is getting in contact with ours. But if they're different, out of contact, I don't see how you can imagine them.
Thank you. I suppose some people might say, well, if there is a multiverse, and maybe there's the big if, and whether we can prove it or not, that God would be God of the multiverse just as much as God of the universe.
Oh yes, I'm of course he is. Yes, I'm not saying God can create an infinite number of universes. I'm sure he can. But the question is, how do we know they're there? How do we know? God knows, but I don't. And that's the issue.
Thank you. I think at that point I will draw our questions to a close and bring this session to a finish. Thank you, Roger, ever so much for talking to us. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for listening so well, and some really good questions that have come in.